Okay, I'm delighted and honored to introduce Professor David Livingstone-Smith. David is a professor of philosophy at the University of New England in New Hampshire, where he teaches courses on philosophy of psychology, philosophy of mind, metaphysics, and philosophy of race, among other topics. David earned an MA from Antioch University and a PhD in philosophy from the University of London, King's College. He is the author of 8 books, including the award-winning Less Than Human: Why We Demean, Enslave, and Exterminate Others from 2011. He has widely written on psychoanalysis and philosophy of psychology and philosophy of biology. Today, he is here to talk to us about his latest book on inhumanity, dehumanization, and how to resist it, which was just published in June by Oxford University Press. I read it, I enthusiastically recommend it. It's a very accessible philosophical and psychological investigation of the mechanisms of dehumanization, and it further draws lessons for resisting it. So David, we are absolutely delighted to have you and really look forward to this talk. Just the format Katie just posted. David will speak for 30 minutes. The rest of the time will be devoted to questions and answer. You can raise your hand or request to speak, write RTS in the chat box. So we'll do it this way for after the talk. Of course, everybody is to mute themselves except the speaker. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Candice. So, how can should I adjust this like this? No. Trying to get the right view here. Ah, okay, I can see everybody, including myself. Good, well, thank you for coming. It's very strange giving a talk on Zoom. It's stranger than teaching a class on Zoom, and that's pretty weird. Because normally, rather than sitting here at my desk in my study in New Hampshire, I would be on a stage, actually very nervous in front of you, hoping to make a good impression, hoping to be intelligible. But that kind of situation psychs you up, so you perform well. This is a different thing. I have to sit in the chair. I can't move around. And so on. So look, I'm going to talk to you, as Candice said, about my newest book, or rather about what I attempt to explain in my newest book, which is called On Inhumanity, Dehumanization, and How to Resist It. I guess the best way to start would be to tell you a little bit about why I wrote this book, and indeed why I wrote my next book, which is a somewhat more academic treatment of the same subject matter, which will come out sometime next year with Harvard University Press. It's called Making Monsters. So back, around 2006 or 7, I was working on a book about war and human nature, and I came across all this dehumanizing propaganda in the literature on war, enemies being presented as subhuman creatures, as monsters, as vicious animals, and so on. And I thought this is really, really interesting. And a friend convinced me I should write on this, particularly as I discovered that almost the entire literature on this phenomenon is in social psychology. Like, philosophers were doing practically nothing, really practically nothing on this. And political scientists were doing practically nothing, all social psychology. And I wasn't like real impressed with the social psychological literature. So I wrote my first book on dehumanization, which came out in 2011, called Less Than Human, subtitled Why We Demean, Enslave, and Exterminate Others. Subtitle's a little misleading, but publishers do that. They push for titles and subtitles, and it's very often a compromise. So in that book, what I tried to do is present a comprehensive theory of dehumanization and trace its history. And it was the first book to do that in the English language. There's still no single author book apart from my 2 books on this in the English language that attempt to really delve into the nature of dehumanization. And when I was writing that, I was kind of working it out as I went along. I did present a picture of what dehumanization is and how it works. But in the intervening, 9 years, 8 years, 9 years, of course, I've changed my mind about some matters. I've made my account of dehumanization, I think, more sophisticated. I've responded to criticisms of the original account, and that's why I wrote this book, both to sort of update my views and this is very important to me, write something accessible for a general readership. Because I think, and you'll get the sense of this as I proceed, this is a very, very, very important topic. It's a life and death topic, because this phenomenon, dehumanization, is associated with the very worst things human beings have done to one another. It's associated with genocides and oppressions and lynchings and so on. And so it's something that we really, really need to understand and need to be vigilant about. And I'm not interested in writing some, obscure thing that 12 people will read and make nitpicky comments about in dusty philosophical journals, right? That's not my mission. My mission is to raise awareness generally. So I'm going to start out with the picture that I painted in the 2011 book, and then point to a couple of problems with that picture and explain how I've modified my position on dehumanization. All right, and this is a sketch, because really, to understand dehumanization, you have to come at it in all sorts of different ways, and the work branches out to all sorts of different areas. For instance, you can't just think about psychology. On my view, dehumanization does happen in people's heads, but dehumanization is a psychological response to political forces. So we need to study ideology and propaganda. We need to look at how dehumanizing ways of thinking manifest in distinct cultures. We need to think about what it is to even consider someone as human, like what does human mean? And consider things like the intimate connection between dehumanization and race, or racialization, racism. So it branches out in a lot of directions. And this is kind of a taster. It'll give you a sense of what I have to say in the most recent book, but it's by no means comprehensive. Okay, so we can start with what is dehumanization? And that's a surprisingly complicated question to answer, because ever since the term was introduced into the English language in the very early 19th century, I believe it was 1819, dehumanization's accumulated a lot of different meanings. And you can see that by just Googling the word dehumanization. You'll get like 8 million hits. And even if you knock out all the vernacular uses of dehumanization and just stay with the scholarly uses, there are 8 or 10 different conceptions of what dehumanization is. In other words, there are 8 or 10 different views on what the word dehumanization names. Now, none of these, you can't say they're right or wrong, they're just alternatives. So what's important is to really specify, anyone who's talking about this stuff, to specify what they mean. And here's what I mean. Dehumanization is the attitude of conceiving of others as less than human creatures. I don't mean lesser human. I don't mean not fully human. I mean less than human. And that contrasts with a whole bunch of other views, like the idea that dehumanization is thinking of others as just objects, or treating them badly, or the idea that dehumanizing others is using certain kinds of slurs against them. Those are all different conceptions, and they're only loosely related. So in my view, dehumanization happens in your head. The actual act of dehumanization is psychological. It's just that we can't make sense of that psychological state properly without looking at the world around people's heads, not just in their heads. All right, so that's the definition. And dehumanization in that sense, I mean, you can go to any genocide. One of my things when I give talks often is talking about the lynching of African Americans and the way African Americans were described in the media of the day. We find this rampant dehumanization there. So it's important in that respect, but it presents a puzzle straight away. And that puzzle is, look, how is it possible to look at another member of our species and think of them as not a member of our species? Right, so let's do a little game. Let's say you're all committed Nazis. You're all SS officers. And let's say that I am a Jew, which I am, in fact. So you look at me and you see a being which is, in every significant respect, indistinguishable from anyone that you would consider a genuine human being. You know, I'm bipedal, I wear clothes, I speak your language, I put up an umbrella when it rains, I have hopes and fears and care for my children and all, you know, everything. So how could you seriously maintain, and I assure you that committed Nazis would seriously maintain this. This isn't just a way of talking. They didn't mean it metaphorically, that I am an Untermensch, a subhuman. Well, it must be the case, then, that you Nazis think that although I appear human, I don't possess what makes a being human. And that's something internal, that's something on the inside. So there's appearance, and now I'm going to use a little bit of jargon. It's a very tricky bit of jargon. There's appearance, how things look, how things seem, and there's essence, that which makes them what they are. And, you know, this distinction is actually a very important, we're going to leave philosophy to the side. It's an important psychological distinction. Because, let's say, since 1989, when the first paper was actually written on this by a couple of psychologists, psychologists have been doing a lot of research into what's called psychological essentialism. And the idea of psychological essentialism is that we human beings are just naturally inclined to divide the world up, the world of living things up, into what we philosophers call natural kinds, like kinds of things like biological species. And to think that what makes any individual a member of one of these kinds, a member of one of these categories, is something unobservable inside of them, which the two psychologists who did the first work on this call the essence, right? So what makes, let's take an animal, my favorite animal, the North American porcupine. Well, what makes a porcupine on that view is not how it looks. That's all symptomatic, right? It's something inside, some inner porcupineness, the porcupine essence. Because of course, you can have all sorts of mutant and deviant porcupines that don't have the ordinary appearance of a porcupine, and yet they're still porcupines. So this is a way of thinking which is very common, it's very robust. We find it even in quite young children. And it's that psychological disposition that accounts for how you could look at me, a human appearing being, and think, well, he's not really human at all. He's subhuman because my essence my appearance belies my essence. I'm sort of, in your eyes, you Nazis, a counterfeit human being. right? Like a counterfeit $20 bill. Looks just like a $20 bill, but isn't a $20 bill. So that way of thinking comes really easily to us. If you doubt it, just think of your experience watching a horror movie, where it's perfectly acceptable, say, that a human-looking being like a vampire isn't human at all on the inside. I mean, we find that really easy to get, that idea. Or if you're a devout Roman Catholic, for that matter, and think that the host and the sacramental wine are literally the body and blood of Christ. Well, they don't look like it. You know, a little cracker doesn't look like human flesh or divine flesh. But of course, the idea when Roman Catholic philosophers got to work on this was that the appearance is misleading. It's the essence that matters. Okay, now is this making sense to y'all? Can I see some nods? Yeah, you're kind of, okay, good, because I don't want to talk gibberish. That gives us a notion of what's non-human, but it doesn't give us a notion of subhumanity, less than human. The idea of subhumanity implies hierarchy, right? There's human and there's below human. And I think this is related to another psychological disposition, one which has not been studied by psychologists. I keep trying to get psychologists to be interested in this, which is our tendency to arrange natural things on a hierarchy from higher to lower. Now, historians of ideas refer to this as the great chain of being. It's the title of a book that was written in the 1930s, the one book on this subject, by a philosopher named Arthur O. Lovejoy. And Lovejoy argued that this idea of a natural hierarchy, and traditionally sort of God at the top, and then the archangels and the angels, and then we human beings modestly place ourselves just below the angels, and then all the different sorts of animals down, 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 with diminishing degrees of perfection. Lovejoy says, well, this really came out of bits and pieces taken from Aristotle and Plato, synthesized in late antiquity. And then this model of the natural hierarchy had a career and died out in the late 18th century, early 19th century. It was in his view, a distinctively European phenomenon, which is no more. That's utterly, in my view, false. It's a great work of scholarship, but those two central components are false. In the first place, we find this kind of hierarchical thinking all over the place. You can look at many different cultures and find it. And the second, it hasn't gone away. If a mosquito were to buzz into your room, I would bet that you would not hesitate to swat it. And if I asked you, how could you do that? How could you take the life of a mosquito? Your response would be something like, it's just a mosquito. It's down there on the hierarchy. So this hierarchical thinking, even professional biologists who should know better, slip into this way of thinking. It's quite deeply, ensconced in our consciousness. In the book, I tell a story about why I think that is. There's too little time to go into that in detail here. So the point is that kind of thinking, that hierarchical thinking, this higher and lower thinking, gives us a notion of subhumanity. So the picture I painted in Less Than Human was, when we dehumanize others, we think of them as having the essence of an organism that's lower on the hierarchy, a human appearance, but an essence that belongs properly to something lower on the hierarchy. So human on the outside, subhuman on the inside. I also make the case that the reason that this happens has to do with disabling inhibitions against harm. So to put it crudely, any reservations we might have as hypersocial primates, which we are, against killing or doing sublethal harm, serious sublethal harm to others, can be overridden by the belief that they're not really human beings at all. Okay, and that's basically the picture in that book. Now, what's wrong with it? Well, a couple of very central things are wrong with it. One is that people who dehumanize others also refer to them as human beings and treat them in ways which are only apt for the treatment of human beings. Very often, if you look at dehumanizing discourse, what you find is in the same sentence, someone refers to a group of others as less than human and refers to them as human. And that's led some people, some philosophers in particular, to be skeptical about whether dehumanization is a genuine phenomenon. They think, well, it can't be. It must just be a way of speaking. Because look, these dehumanizers also talk about these others as human. Let me give you an example, which I have cleverly bookmarked. This is from 1993. There was an episode in a little town in Romania called the Hetărani pogrom, in which a mob of Romanians and Hungarians attacked some Romani people, killed two of them. Two were burnt to death. I believe the other two were clubbed to death. And then they proceeded to burn down 12 homes of Romani people. Romani meaning is what is colloquially referred to as gypsies, right? And a reporter interviews one of the mob, a woman named Maria, and listen to what she says. It's from the Independent newspaper. On reflection, she says, it would have been better if we had burnt more of the people, not just the houses. We did not commit murder. How could you call killing gypsies murder? Protested Maria. Gypsies are not really people, you see. They're always killing each other. They are criminals, subhuman vermin. They are certainly not wanted here. Now, if you listened, you'll have noticed she alternated between referring to Roma as human. She says, it would have been better if we killed more of the people. And then she says, they're not really people, right? And this is absolutely typical. So that's one problem with my 2011 picture. The other is, in fact, dehumanized people are often not referred to simply as lower animals, but they're referred to as monsters and demons. And there's no place on the great chain of being for that, right? You know, we don't buy into species of monsters and demons anymore. 500 years ago, yes. So those are two serious problems, and I address them in precisely the same way. And this is one of the main things that's new in the book. So let me very briefly tell you about that, and then we can open it up. And you can ask me whatever you want to ask me, and, you know, challenge whatever you want to challenge or whatever. Here's what I think really goes on with dehumanization. I think, going back to our example, that when you, in fact, look at another human being, when you look at a human face in particular, you cannot help responding to that other as a human being. That's built in. That's a gut level response. Psychologists would say it's modular. It just happens. It's automatic. Boom. Of course, there are some exceptions. In biology, there are always exceptions. But at the same time, a great deal of what we believe, a great deal of what we accept as true, we get from people who we regard as authorities. So this desk in front of me here seems to me to be utterly without gaps. Solid object, there are no gaps, you know, in it. Any physicist will tell me that it's mostly empty space, right? My eyes deceive me. It's mostly empty space. And I accept that. Why do I accept that? Because a physicist is supposed to know. I grant them that kind of epistemic authority. The problem comes when we have people in positions of power and authority who want us to do terrible things to others, or who have these deeply derogatory beliefs themselves. So if you think, you Nazis, that I'm a subhuman, you probably got that idea. It didn't arise spontaneously from within your mind. You got it from propaganda. You got it from the Nazi race experts who, with the full weight of scientific authority behind them, could assert that Jews are a separate race and indeed are subhuman creatures. And the same in the United States, if you were a white racist participating in say, a spectacle lynching, you're a member of a crowd of maybe 10,000 people watching a human being being tortured for hours and then burnt to death, because that's what these lynchings were like. It's not the cleaned up version in the movies, right? Everyone in your community, the local pastor, the sheriff, your parents told you that these Black people, they're not really human beings. They're some kind of primitive animal. And of course you take that on, because almost all of what we believe we get in this way. It's called testimonial knowledge. So what happens when people are dehumanized, on one hand, we can't help regarding them as human. On the other hand, we've drunk the Kool-Aid, we've taken on either this entrenched ideological position in our culture or propaganda that's generated, telling us Hutus that the Tutsi are cockroaches. And that gives us two simultaneous images, two simultaneous contradictory representations of those whom we dehumanize. We see them as human and we see them as subhuman. And this has two effects. One is it's responsible for this alternation that we saw in Maria's discourse that I read to you. Another is it turns them into uncanny, terrifying fusions of human and subhuman. In other words, it turns them into monsters. Now, there's a whole body of really interesting philosophical work on monsters. What is it to be a monster? And again, I explain it in detail in the book. All I can say here at this point is that fictional monsters, and all monsters are fictional, are uncanny fusions of contradictory kinds of beings. Right? Like a werewolf is a wolf and a human being. A zombie is a dead person and an alive person at the very same time. These are impossible beings. And this impossibleness is part of it accounts for the unique effect of monsterization. And so in the most toxic forms of dehumanization, those others that are hated and despised and spat upon and persecuted are seen not as human, but not just as subhuman creatures either, but as human and subhuman in one horrific package. And this amplifies the sort of the sense that these are threats, that these are dangerous. They must be stamped out. They're seen as formidable enemies. So, I mean, this is the, let me check the time here. Okay, I managed that quite precisely. You know, this is the short story, as it were. For the longer story, for the detail, I would need to either to talk to you a lot longer, or preferably you read the thought out account on Inhumanity. Okay? So I hope that was intelligible. And
thank you, David. That was really wonderful. So I'm going to ask the first question, and I would like everybody in the live chat to write RTS if they want to speak in person, or else post a question that I can read for everyone. So in August, I think I was reading your book shortly after, the Golden State Killer was sentenced to life in prison. So in August in California. There were 3 days of testimony from dozens of victims who detailed the attacks, so a lot of sexual attacks. And they described D'Angelo as subhuman and a sick monster. And so they were using that essentialist language. And so I wanted to ask whether, because that's not something you talk about in the book, whether you have any concerns about dehumanizing the dehumanizers. Actually, I think you do.
I do mention it.
Can I just
early on?
with, like, there's another part of the question, which is about the effects of also, well, slightly different, but so the effect of dehumanization on the dehumanizers themselves. And Aimé Césaire, who's a French poet and Afro-Caribbean author and politician from Martinique, so region of France, saw the appearance of concentration camps in Europe as a result of European colonial domination. And he thought that colonization had just irreversibly warped the moral capacities of Europeans, that it had decivilized the colonizer, brutalized him, degraded him, awakened in him buried instincts and that sort of thing. And so I wanted to ask you about these kind of two facets of the dehumanizer.
Okay. So I think these two things I can weave I can address in a single response, because they are interwoven with one another. So I briefly alluded to the function of dehumanization, what it's for, when I was speaking. And let me kind of describe it in a different way. Dehumanization gives us moral distance. And it's moral distance that allows us to perform acts which would otherwise be, for most of us, very difficult to do. Now, moral distance is just one form of distance, right? The fact is, despite what you see in the movies, killing others up close and personal or abusing them horribly is not easy. Certainly people who and there's a growing literature on this, who have looked into the eyes of another person and plunged a blade into their guts, that can destroy them. That can destroy them psychologically. It haunts them for a lifetime. So the reason for that is that we human beings are hypersocial. We're extremely social animals. We're the most social of mammals. Our very existence depends on cooperation and group life. You have to go to the ants and the bees to find organisms as social as we are. And of course, they have a much simpler way of life. But we're also like really smart. So despite the fact that so let me add something in between. Any social animal has to have very powerful inhibitions against these acts of violence, at least against community members, because it's almost definitional, right? You can't maintain a social way of life if you're ripping each other's throats out. So nature, I believe, has endowed us with inhibitions like this, just because we're the kind of animals that we are. But we're also really smart, and we're capable of recognizing that it can be deeply advantageous to us, whoever us is, to exterminate others, to steal their resources, to create Lebensraum, living space, to enslave them, to exploit them. And over the centuries, then, we developed various methods to make this easier, to override or undo or disable our inhibitions against doing harm. We became very good at it. Dehumanization, or I should say in this context, dehumanizing propaganda, is one of these. It's not the only one. So it's not necessary, but it really helps if you want to do bad things. Just as the creation of long-range weapons helped, from the 14th century, in the 100 Years' War, when the British developed the longbow, which allowed them to fight the French from a great distance. It makes killing easier. Well, that's physical distance. Dehumanization and some other methods create moral distance. We can put the other at arm's length. Okay. So it's very common to think of and to describe people who do terrible things as monsters, as beasts, as bad to the bone. And that has the function of creating moral dissonance, right? Well, why might we want to create moral distance in that kind of context? Well, actually, prosecutors going for the death sentence often do that because it's easier to, to give a death sentence if it's a subhuman monster, right? But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the genocidal killers in Bosnia, or the Nazi high command, or the mass killer that you were speaking about, Candice. And what it does is it says, this being is nothing like me. This being is nothing like me. So you're creating moral distance. But in creating moral distance, you're doing something actually very, very destructive. First of all, you're falsifying reality. Because as I said, there aren't any monsters. Monsters are from fiction, from nightmares. Whatever the person did, be it Adolf Eichmann or whomever, they're human beings. And it's very, very important for us to recognize that, because they hold up a mirror to what is possible for us, just in virtue of being a human being. And of course, that's something that a lot of people don't want to know about. A lot of people say, well, if I was in Germany in 1939, I wouldn't have gone along with the Nazis. Yeah, sure. Easy to say. Odds are you would have. So it's corrupting in that sense. But it also, of course, now to go to the example of colonialism, that act of dehumanization disinhibits terrible things. So it's corrupting in another sense as well, right? In dehumanizing others, it becomes possible for us to commit terrible atrocities and terrible injustices that would otherwise be really, really hard to do, right? So in two senses, it's bad. It's bad for the dehumanizer.
Thank you. So the first request to speak is by Patrick Cullen.
Hi, can you hear me?
Patrick,
you're muted.
Unmute yourself.
Sorry, my headphones must not work. So my question was, you said that dehumanization is due to essence and our lack of recognition of someone's essence, or rather a recognition that someone's essence is non-human.
Yeah.
So my question is, do you answer in your book, and this is kind of multifaceted, but do you answer what makes us human, like the ineffable qualities that make us human?
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, human beings don't have an essence. That essentialistic thinking actually is scientifically objectionable. There aren't any such things, but it's what I call a folk metaphysics. It's kind of it's rooted in our ordinary ways of thinking. Now, with respect to the category of the human, here's an interesting thing. If you ask people what human is, like what is it for a being to be human, they'll say, oh, science has shown us that's to be a member of the species Homo sapiens. Well, actually, science hasn't shown that. And if you look at the scientific literature, the use of the word human is all over the map. So human is sometimes treated as a synonym for Homo sapiens, or the subspecies Homo sapiens sapiens, or the genus Homo, or any other kind of grouping of our ancestors going back to the common ancestor with the chimpanzee, right? And you might think, well, why is that? Is this just not enough evidence? Well, no, evidence has nothing to do with it. It's because human isn't a scientific concept at all. It's a folk concept. It's like the concept of a weed. Well, what's a weed? Well, it's a plant kind of that you don't want growing in a cultivated area. So it's the idea of a weed comes from our social practices, our ways of life. If you actually look at how people use the word human, both in the scientific sphere and in cultures all over the world and in racist and dehumanizing literature as well, basically it means one of us, our kind. So when we describe others as human, we're granting them a certain kind of status. You're saying they're one of us in a very basic sense, in an essential sense. And therefore, dehumanization requires that we think of these others as not our kind, right? So I have a very odd theory of the human here. Human is an ideological, essentially a political construct.
Thanks. I'm going to give you two questions from the chat. So Kalim asks in general, what are the ways that we can resist dehumanizing others? And Sharon asks in particular about the ability of people to learn, how racism works in order to fight it and to unlearn perhaps the misinformation about other groups.
Okay, great. So we'll work backward from the second to the first. Again, this is a piece of the picture that I didn't articulate in the 30 minutes spiel to you. Dehumanization is almost always related, maybe that's a bit too strong, very, very often. A dehumanized group of people is first racialized. They're thought of as another race. And I think that there's a very important reason for that, which is the idea of hierarchy is built into the concept of race. So I'm one of these people. Look, philosophers of race, there are two general takes. Some people think races are genuine biological categories. Very few philosophers think that. There are some. But the person on the street definitely thinks that. The other view is that races are invented. They're social inventions. And people who hold that view, some think they're inventions, but they're real. Like Zoom is an invention, but it's real, and Thursdays are, and marriage is, and so on. Those are all real things that are invented. And others think of races as fictional, as inventions that aren't real, like Bigfoot and the Tooth Fairy and stuff. I'm in that last group. But it doesn't matter here which particular line you take. The point is, what I argue in the book and elsewhere, is that the idea of hierarchy is built into the idea of race. So race isn't a clean concept. It's not just a descriptive concept. It has this, what philosophers like to call normative force. When groups of people are racialized, they're demoted in the human category. Now, and of course, the racializers then elevate themselves by doing this. I call racism, or rather I call dehumanization racism on steroids. Because what's involved there is a group of people is not only seen as defective or inferior human beings, but they're excluded from the category of the human altogether. Now, so in my view, this whole way of thinking about human beings, bound up with ideas about race, is just essentially toxic. It's scientifically, it's fantasy land, and it's essentially toxic. And it has a function of like dehumanization does, of permitting exploitation, harm of various sorts, and so on. So what I'm going to say about dehumanization also applies to race. I think there are basically two fronts on which we combat these things. We can combat them. One has to do with knowledge of ourselves. we have a vulnerability to certain kinds of propaganda and ideology. There are certain kinds of terrible things which, because of the way that the human mind is configured, are very easy for us to fall into. Like I said, most of us, if we were, brought up in the 1930s in Germany, would be Nazis. Right? This kind of racist and dehumanizing propaganda is very powerful. So we need to understand something about the way our minds are constituted to help us resist that, to help us resist these forms of propaganda. So self-knowledge. We should understand, or come to understand, we should have it explained that this hierarchical thinking and this essentialistic thinking that I described is part of us, right? That's the only way we can remain vigilant about ourselves. And that's an ongoing project. It's not like you clean yourself out and you're immune. There isn't any inoculation against racism or dehumanization. So it's an ongoing project. So that's education, and let's call it education in human nature, psychological education, self-knowledge. There's also cultural education. I think it's very, very, very important for history to be taught properly. And the United States does a terrible job of this. I know that. I teach a course on race, racism, and beyond. My students really don't know much about the atrocities associated with race in our history. And I think one reason they've only gotten what I call the cartoon version of this is because the United States has never really had to own up, right? We weren't brought to our knees in a massive war. So we could maintain certain sorts of illusions, even while granting that bad things happened, not granting the full horror of those things. But that's very important, because if you recognize that we did this, then you recognize, just in virtue of that we are capable of doing this. So do you understand? It's a humbling experience to get rid of some of those illusions. So those are two kind of educational things. Then there's looking outward, right? It's taking action in the political sphere. It's supporting institutions like a free press and a judiciary that can stand up against these kinds of forces, which are so powerful and so easily subvert our lives, right? The rule of law and all that kind of stuff. So two sides, and neither is easy, but I think increasingly important as we move into a future where I think it's overwhelmingly likely that we will experience some of the worst of what human beings can do to each other.
Thank you. Nathan Tang will ask you a question now.
Hello. I was kind of reminded by your talk with thoughts on like non-dualistic thinking, because if we're talking about dehumanizing someone and thinking about that person as having an essence that is lower than human, when everything else tells you that that person is a human, and that's like putting like two separate fundamentally different things.
Yeah.
And if we're, I'm curious what you think about I guess people who think that all humans have the same essence. And I was wondering that how can you also move beyond simply just educating yourself about race and things of that nature, and actually realizing that, like, through your actions and through your actions, how can you realize that people do have the same essence, and like people are, people that look like people are actually human?
Yeah, so it's not something you realize, it's something that you grant. It's like human rights. Human rights aren't hanging out around out there in the world. It's something that we implement. Ultimately, these are questions about what kind of world you want to live in. I think all moral questions boil down to that. So it's not a fact that people have a human essence, because people don't have essences, at least in this sense of the word. To embrace another as human is to engage in an act of identification and inclusion, right? So it's a stance that we take rather than a recognition. How do you do that? It's hard really when you think about the question to make sense of the question. All I can say is you just do it. But there are obstacles in the way of doing it. So I guess the way to answer your question is we need to address the obstacles. The rest will take care of itself. And those obstacles, I mean, I'm not a hopeful person, or I'm not an optimistic person, let's put it that way. I write on dark things, but I am hopeful in the sense that I think it's worth pursuing to try and do something about this. And even if I'll speak colorfully, even if the forces of evil win, at least we've given it our very, very best shot. What we have going for us is a gut level tendency to experience others as fellow human beings. So we've got something to work with there. And that means in order to overcome some of these terrible things, we need to proceed from that basis and be critical and reject and understand our tendency to fall in with this other stuff, if that made any sense at all. By this other stuff, I mean the propaganda, the ideology, the representations. And make no mistake, the dehumanizers have the best stories. You know, you have someone like Richard Rorty coming along saying, well, we'll fight dehumanization by telling other stories. Sentimental education, he calls it. Now, dehumanizers have the best stories. Fear and terror, terror, monstrousness, and so on. Those are way more motivating than the nice stories, unfortunately.
Thanks. I'm going to give you 3 questions from the chat. So Anushka asks what the motivation for dehumanizing in general, or if there's a common trait. She brought up the Indian caste system. Ian and Alisa are interested in the psychological effects on dehumanizers. So whether they experience guilt, PTSD, or whether the successful propaganda manages to change their reactions to it, and whether there's any research about the aftermath on recognizing one's errors and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, okay. So despite all that's been written, we don't know too much about these things. And I really try not to bullshit when I talk about them. Again, they're too important. I can give you some of my impressions. So dehumanization, like I said, it comes from outside of our heads. It doesn't arise sort of endogenously. And I think, by the way, that's one of the real problems with the psychological literature, that it pays generally only lip service to the political sphere. Dehumanization happens typically, I believe, when those in positions of authority form the belief that it's advantageous to get us to harm others. That's how racialization happens too. So it's a motivated procedure. Now, that doesn't mean that those in positions of power disbelieve what they say. In fact, the propaganda is much more effective if they actually do believe it, because they can express themselves more forcefully and consistently and passionately. Now, of course, people might believe it's advantageous to harm others for all kinds of reasons. So we don't need that kind of fine grain. That would be misleading. I think suffice it to say that they want to get us to do stuff, bad stuff. So the psychological effects on the dehumanizer, you know, I can only, it's not quite just a guess, but it's very partial. Dehumanization is always ambivalent, right? Good old Freudian term there. I was a Freud scholar in my former life. And actually, Freud's always there looking over my shoulder when I'm writing, giving me ideas. That is, anyone who thinks of another group of people as less than human also thinks of them as human, right? They have this mixed image. And that means that in doing harm to them, a condition of which for most of us, not everyone, but for the vast majority of us, is to kind of close our eyes to our perception of their humanness. It harms the person who does the harm, right? We have to do violence to ourselves in order to pull this off. Now, some people seem to be able to sustain dehumanizing illusions for a lifetime. Others can't, right? And they suffer psychiatric casualties. You know, they can't keep it up. Once they're out of the scene of action, they're haunted by conscience, and they can't keep conscience at bay. So, I mean, that's the best I can do with that, without just making stuff up.
Thank you. Morgan Knight is going to ask the next question.
Okay.
Hi. So I'm extremely intrigued by basically every single thing that you've said so far, but I have a really specific question about kind of what you see the difference, or if you see a difference, between those that are referred to as monsters versus those that are compared to real animals that do exist, for example, on our hierarchy scale. So in the Holocaust, Jews being compared to cockroaches and rats versus in other systems of genocide comparing them to monsters.
Okay. So good. In the first place, and this is something I haven't said anything about at all, there are different kinds of dehumanization. So I've been talking about the most toxic, the most dangerous kind of dehumanization, the kind of dehumanization we find in genocide and so on. But there are other forms of dehumanization which don't represent the other as dangerous, but simply exploitable. I call that enfeebling dehumanization as opposed to demonizing dehumanization. And so with enfeebling dehumanization, technically speaking, they're not monsters. The dehumanized group is disturbing and creepy and seen as unclean and all that, but not monsters, because monsters have to be dangerous, right? I rely a lot on an analysis of monstrousness from a philosopher named Noel Carroll. And he argues that to be a monster, there are two conditions that have to be satisfied. The other has to be seen as physically threatening. You know, a monster that isn't out to kill you isn't a monster. But that doesn't distinguish monsters from serial killers or, you know, rattlesnakes or whatever. They're all physically threatening. Monster has to be, well, what I call metaphysically threatening. They have to belong to these incompatible categories. They have to transgress the boundaries between things which we hold to be entirely separate. Now, I think that in cases where the dehumanized population is seen as dangerous, my sense is they're always turned into monsters and demons. And we should treat the language being used very carefully, right? So dehumanizing language often gestures at things, without being explicit about it. Let me give you an example. Not on Inhumanity, but in my next book, which should be out next year sometime, I have a chapter entirely about ideology, what ideology is, and present a theory of ideology, and then I do a case study of anti-Semitism from the Middle Ages to the 21st century. And one of the things I say there, and actually, let me correct myself, I also make this point quite forcefully on Inhumanity. 500 years ago, people were totally cool with dehumanizing others as demons, literally speaking, right? So in the High Middle Ages, in Europe, Jews were seen as demonic by Christians, right? And that wasn't just some derogatory way of talking, right? They were literally demonic. But in the 21st century United States, that demons don't cut it anymore, right? The regarding of some population as demons just wouldn't do the work. But we have an equivalent that does the same job, and that's criminal. If you look at how the idea of essential criminality works, it's pretty much indistinguishable from the way the idea of demonicness worked centuries ago, right? So now to return to how you put the question, the representation of others as rats or lice or so on shouldn't be taken as evidence that they're not seen as demons and monsters. Because it's one component of that larger demoniacal and monstrous identity which is foisted on them. Did that make sense to you, Morgan?
Yes, thank you so much.
Great, thank you.
Michael is going to ask the next question.
Hi, David.
Hi, Michael.
You spoke earlier about people being born into or being indoctrinated into these hateful beliefs from a young age. To you, what is the difference, or is there a difference between people who are born into or indoctrinated into hateful beliefs versus those who start without them and then on to their own free will?
Yes, I think there is a difference. And I think it's much harder if you're born into them, generally speaking. And that is just a vast generalization. So my book begins with an autobiographical sketch, and in it I explain I was brought up in the Deep South in the 50s and 60s, the tail end of the Jim Crow era, and everyone around me, basically, apart from my immediate family, were racist. That was just in the air that people breathed. And it wasn't some kind of subtle thing where you had to make inferences, right? It was right out there, blatant, in the open, in a segregated society. So that's really hard to break away from because your social relations are so bound up. Your loyalty to your family, to the friends that you grew up with, that you maybe formed these very deep relationships with. And that all those things, you see, if you change your point of view, it changes your relationship with these people in ways that can be really painful and very difficult. You sacrifice your relationships with the people that you care about most. Whereas taking on something later in life is not necessarily less deep. It can be deep if you're, say, indoctrinated into like a cult-like community. It could be very powerful and very deep. But I think it often is not. Right? So being born into these communities where there are these deeply entrenched ideologies shapes, here's another aspect, it shapes your identity from a very, very early age. So that's hard to get rid of.
Two questions from the live chat, Veronica and Evelyn. They both asked about the complicity in and responsibility for dehumanization by transnational organizations or just other governments, and in academia. So both the question of sometimes, perpetrating, participating in dehumanization, but also responsibilities to prevent.
Yeah. So first of all, dehumanization is often attractive to people who never get blood on their hands, never get their hands dirty, because it helps us be complicit, right? We can just let these things roll on. So, it's very interesting if you look at the literature, which I think is misleadingly called, or literature on the phenomenon, which is, I think, misleadingly called moral injury in combat, where people come back with their minds shattered. And this has to do with having participated in one way or another, acts which are very, very deeply disturbing to them, acts of killing. But the point is, they don't have to have killed. They're just involved, right? They're just part of the machine that produces horror. Now, your question, though, is an ethical question, a moral question. And the way I respond to all such questions is, what kind of a world do you want to live in? Because that's what I think, as I said, morality boils down to. What kind of a world do you want to live in? To my mind, you have an obligation to oppose dehumanization if you want to live in a world in which dehumanization and the atrocities that flow from it do not exist. Simple as that. Now, obviously, there are pragmatic considerations as well. In what circumstances does your voice and your effort make a difference? Those are all considerations. It certainly doesn't mean that, you're doing anything at all by signing a Facebook petition or implementing one, for that matter. I think that's the best I can do with that as well.
Ethan has a question.
Hi there, Professor Smith. So I've been thinking a lot about the way that social media has kind of changed the ability of governments to be able to deliver kind of top-down messages. And I was wondering how you think that can apply to propaganda, and specifically how it can apply for government's ability to give a central message of dehumanization towards a specific.
Yeah, that's a really great question. By the way, all these are really great questions. You're making me think about things that maybe were not central to my thinking prior to your question. So thank you. I mentioned I did this extended case study in my book that's yet to come out about anti-Semitism from the late Middle Ages to 20th century. And that was meant to be illustrative of something that happens quite generally. So in order for oppressive beliefs, in my view, to become ideologies, to have the function of oppression, they have to be reproduced and spread because they have that effect. That is, they selectively benefit one group of people at the expense of another. And so that requires apparatuses of reproduction, right? There has to be ways that these representations of others are reproduced and reproduced and spread and spread and spread. And that implies something really interesting, which is that the more effective these apparatuses of reproduction are, the more quickly these things can happen, and the more thoroughly these things can happen. So if we go to the Middle Ages and the spread of dehumanizing beliefs about Jews, well, the means of reproduction were very inefficient. It would be like passion plays, the occasional sermon, and graphic art, right? So you could go into town and see a representation of what was called the Judensau, the Jew pig, which would, the illustration would be of a pig with often a rabbi gazing into the pig's anus and Jewish people sucking milk from the pig's teats. That was a very popular image, but you know, you had to go into town to see it, right? Once we got the printing press and populations became increasingly literate, then the same sort of propaganda could be circulated much, much, much more quickly, more widely, and more thoroughly, and so could have their toxic effects more effectively. The Nazis realized early on, part of their genius, that the radio would be a great tool for proliferating propaganda, to spreading the word. And so one of Goebbels' projects was to develop a low-cost radio receiver that ordinary people could afford, and then they could listen to propaganda all the time. And indeed, there are studies that show the areas where radio reception were the best. That correlated with deportations and anti-Semitic letters to Der Stürmer, the gutter press newspaper that was rendering the Nazi regime. Okay, now we come to the internet. And of course, there we have the capacity for these toxic things to reproduce with unbelievable speed, to use the term, to go viral. So I think this is a very, very, very dangerous thing. Now, of course, as was the case with the printing press and literacy, that's a wonderful thing too. That all these wonderful things can also be dangerous things.
Thank you, David. So I just want to know that the talk is supposed to end in 1 minute, but if you're okay to take,
Sure.
10 more minutes, maybe.
Sure.
Questions. There is still some, that's why I'm asking.
No problem.
That would be wonderful, but I understand if some in the audience have to leave now. So I'll go ahead and thank everyone for attending. Otherwise, Rodrigo has a question for you.
Okay, Rodrigo.
Yes. Hi, Professor.
Hi.
I wanted to ask you, do humans that have been dehumanized can experience remorse at the end? Or this is, and if this remorse happens to them, is it actually like just a psychological thing? Or is it actually like their own morality on the issue?
Well, so I'll start from the end and work to the beginning. Well, no, maybe I won't. Start from the beginning. Yes, of course they can. They can experience remorse. And really crushing remorse, right? If they've dehumanized others and they've done really bad things, then to recognize that is just unbelievably hard emotionally. But yes, they can, they do, they have. I don't really, I see moral concerns as an aspect of psychology. So, it's my Freudian background coming out again. So I wouldn't separate those two things out. Guilt, obligation, all of those things to my mind are psychological states. And so I think what you're getting at, though, is the question is, can they experience genuine remorse? And I say, absolutely, of course.
Kalim?
Hi, Prof. Thank you for your talk today. It's been great. When I first started listening to you speaking, the idea of like human deservingness of certain considerations always gets my ears pricked up as someone who's interested in sort of general personhood and perhaps maybe moral rights when it comes to animals. At some point in your talk, you sort of spoke about not wanting to give us an essentialist account of humanity or of people.
Yeah.
Does that mean you consider that we dehumanize animals when we treat them in terrible ways?
Good question. Yes. Yes, it does. I think it's perfectly possible to dehumanize. It sounds paradoxical, but that's because we're trapped in this terminology, to dehumanize non-human animals. Because what that means, if you think of what I said about the human, regarding others as human is simply to include them, to say they're our kind, they're one of us in some very fundamental sense. And that does not have to respect species boundaries. The dog that lives with us, I think I should put it that way, we refer to her as a certain person, right? She is, we respect the linguistic norms. She's not human, but functionally, of course she is. Of course she is. She's one of us. One of the problems there, all right, so let me put that slightly differently. If you look across cultures, the notion of humanness, the notion of the us is bounded differently in different cultures. It can be much smaller than a conventional, 21st century American notion, or it can be much broader. It can include kinds of animals that 21st century, Westerners wouldn't include in the category of the human. And that's because whether or not a being is human, in my view, it's not a factual matter. It's a political matter. It's so long-winded way of saying yes. And of course, the attitude towards animals of all sorts, and not just animals, by the way, plants as well, plants are living things, is informed by this hierarchical way of thinking. Unfortunately, I think that hierarchical way of thinking emerged because it was a very effective way of dealing with a problem, a basic problem of human life. And that problem is, what is it permissible to kill? Right? Arguably the central moral dilemma of human life. And so hierarchy was one, I think, a fairly lately developed version of justifying the killing and exploitation of some life forms. Well, no, let the sentence end there, of some life forms.
So Gabby has a question which connects with Alex's question from the chat about the connection between dehumanization and power dynamics in a society.
Okay.
So Gabby's going to ask her
okay, cool.
form of the question.
Okay. So essentially, my question, or I have two or three now I'm thinking about it, is like, what is so attractive about power that people are so willing to dehumanize others in order to be able to obtain it?
Okay. Well, I tend not to think in terms of power because power is an abstraction. I think in terms of goods, right? Now, with respect to, in fact, you could perhaps cash out notion of power in terms of goods. So goods like money, goods like control, goods like sex, all sorts of things that human beings are after. So you might look at power as the ability to secure such things. And then the answer is, well, the stuff you think, the stuff you want, well, there's maybe no deeper story than you want it. Having said that, I have to confess, I don't understand. Maybe this is why I have difficulty answering your question. I don't understand what's attractive about power over others. I just don't get it. So normally when I'm trying to figure these sorts of things out, I look for it in myself. I say, what bit of myself resonates with whatever it is? And when the conversation's about power, I have real difficulty finding that. So I know that was a totally unsatisfactory response.
No, I was just curious.
Well, it was still unsatisfactory.
No, I'm just curious. It was interesting.
Okay, we disagree.
So I do not see any other questions in the live chat.
Okay.
So I'm going to go ahead and thank you so much for taking the time to visit us virtually and talk to us about your book. It was a fantastic intervention. The students in my class are going to continue thinking about it and we'll write a paper about it.
Wow.
So yeah. And thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for all these really, really awesome questions. And I mean that. I'm not just talking. Really awesome questions. And I hope I've given you something to think about, and I hope it was worthwhile you spending your time here with me.